Welcome back, guys, from the lunch break. I hope you all had a good meal and you're not too tired. I have to wake myself up. I needed to make it dark because I want to start by taking you on a trip, and you can better see this in the dark. So, let's all imagine it's 1877. How does this look like? Dark and scary, right? Well, so this is Halloween. Well, the point that I am making here is that this is how nights would have looked like only 140 years ago. That there was no electric light because Thomas Edison had not invented the light bulb yet, which, as some people claim, was one of the biggest inventions of all times. And he really has changed the world with this invention. It is important to recognize how young this is from an evolutionary standpoint in the time that Earth exists, right? It's just 140 years ago. I also put Howard Louis Latimer on the picture as one of the biggest black inventors of all time. They together came up with this commercializable light bulb that has really raced across the globe and electrified the entire world. The first commercial application actually took place close to Vienna, in Brno, where the theater there was the first place where actually the light bulb was applied, even though Edison couldn't come himself. This was a remarkable event. And after that, we all know what happened, leading to how we perceive the world today. Right now, we can make the night a bright place. This is an extreme example, Times Square in New York. But for anybody who has been there, we all know, right? It looks like daylight there at night. There's so many light sources out there, it's hardly distinguishable whether it's night or day. This sort of electric light that allows us to illuminate our nights has also led to something that many of you may have heard of, which is called light pollution. Light pollution is a phenomenon that we know since many of the cities are being illuminated at night and leads to sort of blurring out of the stars that we usually could see if there were no light pollution. This is how typically a night sky looks like. You see the millions of stars out there. You see the Milky Way. Who has seen the Milky Way lately? I haven't in a long time, even though I know it's still out there. So light pollution is changing how we see the sky, but it has also had a profound impact on the flora and fauna on our planet. Here is just one example. These are bats from Puerto Rico who actually forage, eat in dark areas, and then as they excrete the seeds of the fruit they ate, they help reforest rainforests. But in Puerto Rico too, because of the light pollution, these animals are avoiding the light, and in some ways, not only have they disappeared from many places, but they have also hampered the reforestation of the rainforest by not longer being there. And there are plenty of other examples, including us human beings, who are also impacted by this light pollution. This, of course, you also have seen, right? It's a satellite image of our world from up above, how the astronauts would see us. What can you tell me here? Some areas that are really bright, right? Typically the Western world. So now we can play a number game, and we can insert cancer incidence and mortality rates. And what we see, we think, is that in particularly bright areas on this Earth, there's also particularly high cancer mortality. What type of study is this? Yes, an ecological study. So somebody can immediately tell me all the problems with that, right? But nonetheless, so this is the type of study you may have seen 30 years ago, and which led to a hypothesis that has been formulated and subsequently been confirmed. And the hypothesis could go like Any ideas? Light at night could increase cancer risk, exactly. And that indeed has been the hypothesis that has been pursued over the last decades by a variety of means. Some of the earliest studies been looking at flight attendants, for instance, right? Saying that if they fly through the across time zones over many nights, they have exposure to light at night. Other studies have looked at geographic differences in light exposure, Arctic regions. Others have studied blind women, sort of saying, well, they have no light exposure. What happens to those women in the context of cancer development? So lots of studies have tried to answer the question. And before I show you what then the first prospective cohort study showed, which was the Nurses' Health study, I want to go over some of the mechanisms that could potentially link light at night to cancer risk. Anybody an idea? Or is this all completely foreign? Who has never even thought about how this mechanistically could be linked? Those who have thought about it, what were the thoughts you had? Melatonin, yeah. Any other things? Anybody knows what the biological clock is? Right? It's a bunch of neurons in the hypothalamus, right? That is often referred to as the suprachiasmatic nuclei. You may have heard that term. SCN, suprachiasmatic nuclei, is sort of where the biological clock is supposed to sit. And how does this clock receive information about environmental light exposure? The eyes, exactly. It's a mechanism that's not known for very long, indeed only since 2001. So it's not that long ago, actually. There was a discovery made that in the retina, there's a third type of receptor, a non-rod and not cone type receptor, a melanopsin type receptor that is responsible for informing the biologic clock about how much light there is out there. So that was a fundamental discovery, which was made by two independent labs at once. One in the United States, it was Bud Brainard in Philadelphia, and the other one in England, the Deborah Skeen lab that has discovered this type of receptor around the same time. Today we know that this particular receptor is most sensitive to short wavelength light. That's why the arrow is here, a sort of like wavelength that you would expect from a halogen lamp or a neon lamp. That sort of short wavelength light is the one that is most stimulating to our circadian system. And here is just a quick summary of what happens if you have darkness, if there's no light stimulus to the receptor. Then your body knows through these mechanisms that link the retina to the circadian clock in the suprachiasmatic nuclei that now it is dark, and this leads to a release of melatonin, which is released from the pineal gland. And we often call this hormone the hormone of the darkness because it's really, by and large, produced when it's dark. As soon as there is light exposure perceived by the retina, that production stops. So light is a very important stimulus for the circadian clock. It helps us maintain 24-hour rhythms, which, as we now know, are actually essential for almost every single aspect of our life. The most prominent one, all of you know, is the sleep-wake-rest activity cycle, which, you know, we all sleep every 24 hours at least once for a couple of hours. It's a circadian, roughly 24-hour rhythm that we experience. But other functions in our body also follow this circadian rhythm. Body temperature, for instance, is lowest when? Anybody knows? During sleep, exactly. And that's a repetitive thing. Every night when we sleep, typically our temperature is lowest. What about blood pressure? When is that lowest? Typically also when we sleep, exactly. What about secretion of hormones? it depends, right? Which one you're looking at. Some of them have a really distinct 24-hour rhythm, right? Which one comes to mind? Well, we talked about melatonin, right? But others? Growth hormone, or even more so cortisol, yeah. Probably the sex steroids. More and more we are learning that many of these biomarkers are actually experiencing a 24-hour rhythm. Even gene expression follows a 24-hour rhythm, and the immune system, also very important, follows this rhythm. So somehow this is very fundamental and important to life. Any idea why we do have this biologic clock? Not that there's a really good answer, but just some speculation. I want to hear what you speculate. Why do we need a biologic clock? What was this meant for? Yeah?
Maybe so that the body can recover properly, to have like enough energy again for like the next day, or
Yeah.
like everything was a bit programmed, more or less, like what is functioning.
I know. I think it's a really good theory, which has been voiced by other people, which is that, you know, you experience a lot of damage, if you will, to the body throughout the day. So at night, you need this repair time. But even more fundamentally, why does it have to be linked with sunlight, essentially, right? Because artificial light only exists since 140 years. So before that, it was mostly in sync with sunlight, right? What is this for, you think? Essentially, as I said, there is no real good explanation other than just some hypotheses, but one of them is that we are sort of like seasonal animals. You know, as human beings in the past, we needed to go to places when the winter came to hibernate, or we may have not really slept at night but have to hide. And the way we could figure out, in part, that other seasons were approaching is the changes in day length. So that clock allowed us, perhaps, is the thinking, to be able to say, okay, there's a seasonal change coming, and that may require some changes in our attitude. It definitely is important for animals, so one of the potential hypotheses is that this was in the old days also important for us human beings, since we didn't have real watches or real other measures to determine what time of the year it was. So it's probably a very ancient mechanism that was necessary and still is in us, and is most importantly affected by light. And this is why I want to direct your attention now to night work as one of a particularly relevant system to use to study the effects of light at night. Because night workers have their eyes open at night, so they get the full amount of light exposure to their retinal receptors, and therefore will experience to the fullest extent the effects of light at night. And in addition, there's this factor that they tend to be chronically exposed, meaning nobody usually works just one night shift. If you're in an occupation that requires night shifts, you will do this for a longer time, most likely. Chronic exposures, on the other hand, are often required to have an impact on chronic disease risk, right? So you want to have chronic exposure if you're looking to see how a certain exposure affects chronic disease risk. And lastly, shift workers often don't have a choice over what they do. Oftentimes there are economic reasons they're doing shift work, so they're particularly vulnerable, and therefore require our support by studying how any potential effects could be ameliorated. So shift work or night work is the focus. And this is just to also point out that not only light exposure, but some other Zeitgebers exist, sort of other things that can put our clock in a specific different time. What are you laughing at? Yeah, it's a funny word, isn't it? For once I can play up my German knowledge, right? But the most important other Zeitgebers are, besides the sleep-wake cycle, the physical activity, meal timing, and social time, if you will. So those will also have an impact, although they are very strongly intercorrelated. If you think about sleeping, nobody is going to be physically active when they sleep, and nobody is eating when they sleep. All of these are sort of linked with each other, but each of them warrants their own investigation. With looking at night workers, for the first part, we have mostly looked at what light exposure they have experienced. And we are beginning to understand that this light exposure at the wrong time of the day, at night, can have profound impacts on some of the fundamental metabolisms in our body. So here is just one graph showing how the liver will be affected by exposure to light at night, over secretion of hormones at the wrong time of the day, and then ultimately also by body temperature and feeding rhythms, all of which can have an impact on metabolism of food in the liver. And to keep in mind, much of this is regulated by circadian clocks, which we are also just now beginning to understand how complex this system is and how they are interrelated with each other and direct many of these circadian rhythms on a genetic level. Coming back to melatonin, because this is something we have been measuring in observational studies. Melatonin is a hormone, as I said, that's secreted by the pineal gland. And it's important, especially for cancer, because it has been shown to have important oncostatic mechanisms that can halt tumor growth. In animal studies, for instance, it has been shown in various ways that this could be important. One way was to remove the pineal gland in animals and see what this does to tumor growth, showing that if you remove the main production site of melatonin, tumors start growing faster. Another way has been to add melatonin to drinking water and showing that this could potentially stop tumor growth or slow it down. And note, it's one of these hormones that has a circadian rhythm. As I said, it is the hormone of the darkness, so the production occurs almost exclusively at night. One of the few factors that influence how much melatonin one produces is age. We think that with increasing age, the amount of melatonin that any one of us produces at night becomes less, which could make sense because our sleep problems increase as we get older. And given that melatonin has some ability to stimulate sleep, it could be one of the reasons. On the other hand, I do want to say we don't have good longitudinal data on how melatonin really changes in us. So this is based, for the most part, on cross-sectional data. And because of that, we can't fully rule out that perhaps in some individuals a healthy circadian rhythm and melatonin production is preserved even into older age. And that maybe this reduction in secretion with age could be some sort of marker of disease. I think it would be really interesting to have longitudinal data over the lifespan of a person in a larger group of people to confirm that indeed, in every person, melatonin declines with increasing age. So when the idea came up that light at night could increase cancer risk, there were two people who coined the term melatonin hypothesis. It was Richard Stevens and Scott Davis, who in 1986 posed that light at night decreases your melatonin production because of the mechanisms we just looked at. And if you lower your melatonin, like many hormones have compensatory mechanisms, this may lead to an increase in estrogen levels. That was the thinking behind the melatonin hypothesis. Back then, it was already starting to become known that higher estrogen levels are linked to breast cancer. So their hypothesis stated if you downregulate this axis and lead to an increase in estrogen levels, you will have to see a higher breast cancer risk in individuals who experience melatonin suppression through light at night. In the meantime, we have learned that there may be other potential mechanisms that could link light at night to breast cancer risk in particular. For instance, melatonin receptors which have been identified now and can serve as a binding site also for estrogens, sort of similar to the aromatase inhibitors who are blocking the activity of estrogens. And with these hypotheses and ideas in mind, many years ago, the idea came up to use the nurses' health studies to explore whether light at night, or in particular shift work, could be linked to cancer risk. Now, breast cancer obviously was the focus of the melatonin hypothesis, but there was also a group at the same time, around in the 80s, in Canada, who posed that, well, given what you see in all these animal studies, you don't only see an increase in mammary tumors, you also see increases in colon cancer rates, in endometrial cancer rates, in all sorts of other cancers in these animals that were linked to either removal of pineal gland or giving them melatonin in drinking water. So they were essentially saying this mechanism should increase all cancers, not only breast cancer. And we were setting out back then to see whether we would find, in particular, breast cancer risk higher in the night working women in the nurses' health study, but also other cancers. The shift work distribution in the nurses' health study is noteworthy because, especially for questions like these, it's really advantageous to have such a nice distribution. As you can see here, there's about 40% of the nurses in the nurses' health study who never ever worked any night shifts. But the remaining ones worked any amounts of years, including still a sizable number of women who worked 15, 20, or 30 years of night shift in their career. And in addition to this information on their shift work exposure, there's updated information on all the confounders that you could think of at the time for any particular cancer that you investigated. So this was one of the first studies in the prospective nurses' health study, taking into account any potential confounders and looking at whether night work would increase cancer risk. And as you can see here, women who never worked night shifts was the reference group. And then you have women with a few years of night shifts who had an 8% increased risk, and the women with 20 plus years of shift work experiencing a higher risk of 36 to 79% in the two studies that were published. Then, of course, the question was of interest, well, is what we see for breast cancer also the case for other cancers, like this Canadian group was suggesting, right? That light at night should not only impact breast, but also other cancers. And so we began to study each of these other tumors and really want to point out that these various analyses were done in the most thorough fashion possible because they were adjusting for any of the potential confounders that you could think of at the time. And that was possible because the nurses' health study really collected so much information on these potential confounders. So it's one of the most thorough analyses for each of these endpoints. And what was found is that many of these tumors were also increased in the night workers. At the time, there were about 10 studies published, so this is from 2005. There's a reason why I show you this old meta-analysis. There was a suggestion that there's an about 50% increased risk, which brings me back to our previous lecture, 1.51, 51% increased risk, right? And in addition, also around that time, so you see 2006 and 2007, the first two studies published in men came out, not from the nurses' health study, but also prospective cohort studies. The very first one from Japan and the second one from Canada, and each of them showing different but consistently increased risks for prostate cancer in those men. The Japanese study was interesting in that they were able to adjust for perceived job stress, which is a confounder that is hard to find being assessed in any cohort study. And they found a threefold increased risk of prostate cancer among men who worked rotating night shifts. The Canadian study was interesting in that they stratified by when men had begun working night shifts, and they found that especially those in the mid-20s, so the ones that began working night shifts younger, had a higher risk than others. And so this was enough evidence to think, we can see this in observational data. We need some biology to support what we see here. And so an effort was made to validate melatonin as a biomarker, with the hopes to find that in humans also melatonin could be linked to cancer risk. So melatonin is produced at night, and it's very much impacted by light exposure, right? It's very hard to measure, actually. If you take a blood sample, if you take it during the day, people are exposed to light, there won't be any production in their blood, right? If you take blood at night, you usually have to turn on the light to take blood, and that will suppress melatonin production again. So it's not easy to do on a large scale. People have done it in sleep labs with complicated setups, like they would have holes in the wall and draw the blood from outside while it's still dark inside to just preserve the darkness and not disrupt melatonin. Seriously, but in observational studies, there was no way to ever do that, right? So an idea was to take first morning urine and assume that if somebody didn't get up at night and peed, maybe the first morning urine would capture what would be sort of the full secretion that happened overnight. And so that biomarker was validated, needed some time because you needed to be sure, biospecimen in cohort studies are usually stored for a long time. The collection is done in the field, so the samples may not have been processed immediately. We wanted to make sure that none of these factors impacted what we measure. And in the end, it turned out that this was a reasonably good biomarker, which was comparable to measuring cholesterol over 3 years and 5 years also. It remained fairly stable, which is important when you look at cancer as an endpoint. Because if I measure melatonin today and you develop cancer 20 years down the road, I want to be sure that what I measured 20 years ago was not just once and by chance, whatever it was, but a stable marker. So once these validation studies were completed and reasonably satisfying, we set out to look at whether this measure of melatonin among women without night work, just regular people who slept at night, whether those who produced more melatonin at night had a lower breast cancer risk, which would be the expectation. And we did indeed find, not only in one, but in several different cohorts and different studies, that those women who produce more melatonin at night are the ones who have the lowest breast cancer risk. And those with less melatonin, actually these are the ones with the lowest risk, those with less melatonin have a higher risk of breast cancer. And so that's sort of the evidence that was out there when in 2007 IARC convened a monograph session to assess whether shift work could be carcinogenic. Lots of animal data, each of them by and large supportive, although one of the biggest problems with animal data is what? Replicability, right? Oftentimes they're not being tried to be replicated. So for many of them, we don't know if you would conduct the same experiment in the exact same setting, whether it would produce the same results. But nonetheless, the various studies that existed, by and large, pointed towards circadian disruption, melatonin suppression being an important factor in cancer development. And with the limited human studies that I have shown you, there may be 10 studies on breast cancer, a few more in men, and with some of the melatonin data pointing towards an inverse risk among women with highest melatonin production, it was ruled that shift work is a probable carcinogen, class 2A, which in Denmark has subsequently led to a compensation of women who developed breast cancer on the job, it's the only country in the world, to my knowledge, that reacts to class 2A carcinogens. Somebody here from Denmark? I see your smile. Were you aware of that? Okay, good. So it's known in Denmark. Now, all the other countries in the world would react to a class 1 carcinogen to make it an occupational disease that's worthy being compensated for. So Denmark is usually on the forefront here. Yes, Neil?
Yeah, in the UK, I'm on the Industrial Injuries Advisory Council,
Yeah.
which draws up the lists, and we considered this, and we considered there was sufficient evidence, but the relative risk wasn't high enough to put it in the compensatable category.
That's
Because
interesting.
more than a 50% probability for any individual,
Yeah.
which means the relative risk has to be greater than 2.
Right. Yeah, thanks for that information.
We concluded that it was, that the evidence was sufficient.
Yeah, no, I can see that point very well, because I'm not sure what I would have decided if I had to. I just think it's quite straightforward from Denmark to take this action. And as far as I know, it's about 80 women or so who have received this type of compensation. So it's not an overboarding amount of women, but still some women. And I always like to say it's important to keep in mind that even in the nurses' health studies, the risks that we observe are primarily among women who work long durations of shift work, and in the population, those are a small amount. The bigger point to me is, which you will learn now, is that it's not only cancer risk that is higher in these women or men, but also other diseases. So I think if you look at the bigger picture, there is concern, but if you look at the absolute numbers, they will be fairly small, because it's a fairly small amount of women who are exposed to such long durations of shift work. Please.
Do you know how this compensation looks like in Denmark?
Well, they will get some monetary compensation, but I don't know how much, and you probably don't know either. Johnny Hansen would maybe know. I don't think it's, a fortune that they receive. It's more an acknowledgement that there might be some underlying occupationally related issue. But nonetheless, so this was in 2007. The monograph was published in 2010, but the meeting took place in 2007, which is over 10 years ago. And lots of things have happened since then. I want to show you some of the things that have happened since then to give you a bit of a sense of where this field is moving. I want to start out with the study by Ruth Travis that was published 2 years already ago. Time is flying, it seems like yesterday. At the time, it was the largest study. And it did comprise and does comprise a lot of women. Actually, I have the exact number of women included here. Well, only the cases. But in any event, the Million Women study comprises a couple 100,000 women. The EPIC Oxford is fairly large, and the UK Biobank too. I think in total they didn't reach quite 1 million individuals, but it was a fairly large amount of women included. One thing I do want to point out to you guys is, remember when we spoke about Person Month and how you can acquire a lot of Person Months through various ways, right? Or Person Years. Either by following lots of people for a short time or following a few people for a long time, right? I think this is a classic example where lots of people were contributing a short amount of time, because this is the average follow-up, 2.6 years, 3.1 years, and 3.8 years. So while there were lots of women, and in total lots of person years, the follow-up was very short. And if you look at the age of these women at baseline, at enrollment, you can see that these definitely here, and also the other ones, were fairly close to retirement. Now, we are starting to understand that once people stop working night shifts, their risks start getting less again. So maybe, like, you take away the exposure, sort of like when you quit smoking, your risk may slowly come back to baseline over the years. And in that sense, studying women who have retired from shift work is just like studying them at a time period where they may no longer accrue risk because they don't have that exposure anymore. In any event, these are just two of the limitations of that study. Another one is also that the power was limited, because over 2 years, even though it was a lot of women, not so many breast cancer cases accrued in total. If you look at the EPIC, there were only 28 cases among the shift workers. And so they could only look at ever-never shift work, essentially, as an exposure. No measure of how long these women had worked night shifts. And if so, then there was only one case among them. So it was limited in several ways. Nonetheless, the conclusion of that paper that caused a lot of uproar, especially in the community, but also in the news, was that classification of night shift work as a probable carcinogen is no longer justified, which in many ways was interesting because the justification that shift work is carcinogenic was not based on breast cancer alone. Yet they were looking at breast cancer, and with their study were sort of concluding that all of this is not related anymore, any other cancer either. But then also they had all these other limitations and problems. And I think it's a good example, if you look at specific studies, how important it is for you as experts to look at the study more closely before you come up with your own assessment. This clearly here is one that requires a closer look and may not warrant the conclusion they came to. Since 2007, in addition to Ruth Travis' study, lots of other studies have been published and lots of meta-analysis. I am just randomly picking a few here to show you. This one I like because it makes a comparison between Group A, those are case control studies here, and Group B are cohort or nested, so prospective type studies, right? And we're sort of looking whether the overall risk for breast cancer related to shift work is different depending on study design. The conclusion was that not by much. The risk in the more carefully done prospective cohort studies may have been slightly smaller, but overall they reached the same conclusion. And to date, we have way over 60 studies already that have now looked at night work and all sorts of different cancers. The majority is still on breast cancer, but there's lots of other studies now also looking at colorectal, ovarian, endometrial, lung cancer, non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, melanoma, and thyroid cancer. And the vast majority still points to an increased risk for cancer among these women. And for the male cancers, we too have accrued lots of evidence. Think back the 2 studies that had been published on prostate cancer. Now we have over 20 studies, also looking at a variety of different cancers among the men, including prostate, gastrointestinal tumors, and lung cancers. And again, finds for the vast majority an increased risk of these cancers related to shift work. And here is a meta-analysis on all the prostate cancer studies up to 2015, suggesting that there's a significantly increased risk of 1.24 means what in percent? 24%, yes. And then here is one looking at colon cancer, stratifying by a couple of things that I found interesting. For instance, by tumor site, colon versus rectum. Again, by study design, by male versus female, by continent. And you see that there is not much variation there. And in addition to these various studies, also from the Nurses' Health Study, some new evidence has emerged in these past 2 years, which 2 of them I want to show you. One is a follow-up on the earlier studies on night work and breast cancer risk. Now, with much more follow-up. So this is the initial publication from both cohorts. It's Nurses 1 and Nurses 2. The first study, Nurses 1, was published in 2001. The first study, Nurses 2, was published in 2016. And both were updated in 2017 by Lani Vegorsin, with now, as you can see, from 10 up to 24 years of follow-up. And with many, many more cases. These are the number of breast cancer cases in the initial publication, and now with follow-up. Together, between the 2 cohorts, there are about 10,000 breast cancer cases. It's tremendous. And compare that now to the British study, right? With 2 years of follow-up, you may end up having the same amount of person time, but it's completely differently composed, right? Here you have 24 years of follow-up. In the other one, you had 2 years of follow-up, right? And here you have, what now, 200,000 women. There you have 1 million. So it's important to look at these studies carefully. Now, what has emerged from this new publication is quite interesting. Let's take a look. This year I want to show you for the baseline age. I told you that these two cohorts aren't overlapping in their age, right? There's a cell study 2 is the younger cohort. This is the average age here by group of shift work. The variation between the shift work groups is not what I want to point you to, but more the difference in age between the two cohorts, right? Nurses 1, the women were older when we conducted the first study. Nurses 2, the women were much younger. The big difference between the two cohorts is how many more years of night work they would have accrued during follow-up, right? You can see that those women in their mid-30s, with 20 years of follow-up, they have 20 years of full work time exposure of shift work or whatever type of work they do. These women here, on the other hand, may not have had as much exposure with the additional follow-up. Most likely they were retired after 10 years, and then another 12 years of follow-up would have added retirement years. This is important to keep in mind because that's how we interpret what we see. In Nurses' Health Study 1, the overall risk is no longer there that we had seen in the earlier publication. In Nurses' Health Study 2, the risk is equal, if not stronger, compared to the previous publication. So we then set out to stratify by time of follow-up to see whether indeed this adding of retirement years could potentially explain what we found. And it does indeed look as if in the younger women, which is at the bottom here, the first 10 years of follow-up and the second 10 years of follow-up are very similar, most likely reflecting that they continued to work night shifts. In the older cohort on the top here, you see the first 10 years of follow-up here, a suggestion for an increased risk, which is no longer existent in the second half of follow-up, those likely being the years after they had long retired from shift work. We also looked in this study whether there's a difference by ER positive status in the breast and found some suggestion for ER positive tumors, those who respond to hormonal treatment, to be stronger. And we did not find much of a difference between whether or not the women worked pre or post-menopausal shift work. How does this compare to a second study that was done with the Nurses' Health Study, taking a completely different approach now? This was looking at geocoded addresses in the Nurses' Health Study of all the addresses a nurse had lived at over the course of her participation in the study. And Peter James, who was the person who conducted this analysis, retrieved the amount of light exposure each woman experienced at her address based on some data from the US Defense Meteorological Satellite Program Operational Line Scan System, which gets close to 1 square kilometer to a home in order to tell you how much light likely there was. And what Peter found is that on the left you have light at night in quintiles, the first quintile being the least light exposure at night, the fifth quintile being the light exposure being the highest in a given geocoded address. And with this highest light exposure at night, there was a significant increase of breast cancer risk that he could show here. He also stratified by pre versus post-menopausal women, and it looked in this analysis as if the risks were restricted to the younger women, the premenopausal women, because this year is essentially null, but here you have a significantly increased risk. And similar to the previous study on night workers, ER-positive breast cancers seemed to be more affected by any impact of light at night than these ER-negative ones. So the conclusion was then that there might be a connection between both light at night and night work with breast cancer risk, maybe more so in premenopausal women, maybe more so among ER-positive tumors. And today, I think it's fair, if you take all of this into consideration, that the assessment from 2007 probably hasn't changed much. Whether it has gotten stronger is up to discussion, and I think warrants that you really carefully look at each single study and summarize the effect. But clearly the totality of this evidence continues to support a carcinogenic effect. And now we are starting to become interested in sort of the next frontier of this research, which is to see whether there are particular subtypes among the night workers who are most affected. And I want to show you some of the work we have done to that end. The first one that raised some interesting ideas regarding genetics was published by Jennifer Monsees. And she looked at 15 selected circadian genes and was interested in whether one of these genes interacted with night work to predict the risk of breast cancer in the women. And interestingly, she found that one of these clock genes, the AMPAS2 gene, there was indeed a suggestion for the women who were, particularly one, the homozygous ones, these here, had an almost threefold increased risk even after 2 or more years of night work, so even after very short exposure to night work, suggesting for the first time that there may be an indication for a genetic phenotype that could perhaps, help delineate women at particularly high risk. I don't know, anyone here knows Erhard Haus? Have you heard of him? He was one of the big experts in the field. He knew every single study that had been published. He had been working in the field of circadian biology for many, many years. He passed away a couple of years ago, but he was really a fixture and, somebody to admire for the work he had done. And he already way back said, I think the whole shift work problem is very important. Cancer is just one aspect. And I think he was right from all we know now. We have started to look at all sorts of different endpoints in relation to night work. Here is one looking at developing high blood pressure, so becoming hypertensive. First of all, if you measure melatonin, lower melatonin levels not only predict breast cancer risk, as we have heard, but it also predicts whether somebody goes on to develop hypertension. And for the first time, we see a variation by ethnicity. Particularly black women in the Nurses' Health Study are the ones who, if they have low melatonin, go on to develop hypertension. What about cardiovascular disease? Here's a study showing that with every additional year of shift work, the risk of developing cardiovascular disease goes up. And at the same time, the longer a person has stopped working night shifts, the more their risk goes down again. So in a very dynamic way, suggesting that shift work can increase, but once you stop the exposure, also let you go back to baseline risk. With cardiovascular disease perhaps being a good model for this here, because it seems to react faster to the exposure, where we already see increased risks after 5 years of shift work. Compare this to cancer, where you need usually exposures of at least 15 years to see a heightened risk of cancer. So a suggestion that stopping shift work eventually can lead to baseline risk. Diabetes risk, we found that melatonin also significantly predicts whether somebody is going on to develop diabetes. These are all nested case control studies, so prospective case control studies, where the marker in the urine, melatonin, was measured many years before they went on to develop the disease. And also, if you look at night work per se, not just melatonin in the urine, you see that individuals tend to have a higher risk of type 2 diabetes if they work night shifts. And here, so specifically what we had found in an earlier publication, that with every 5 years of shift work, your risk went up by 11%, and that you also would gain weight with every couple of years of shift work. But then, for the first time, seeing an interaction with chronotype in that study, showing that if you stratify people by chronotype, well, I'm going to ask you, anybody knows what chronotype is? Somebody wants to volunteer?
You're more prone to face with a night or the term. I mean, if you're more prone to face at night, you're more active at night than during the day.
Yes. I mean, we consider it by and large a trait. So people, if you don't know what chronotype you are, you're probably one of the 70 or more % who are neither morning nor evening types. There are lots of people somewhere in between. But there's also an amount of people who classify themselves as definite morning types or definite evening types. And as you say, this is correlated with the time they prefer to sleep, essentially, or be active. So if you look here, the evening types tended to have a higher risk of developing diabetes, and the morning types a lower risk. If you examine what happens to these individuals if they work night shifts, for the evening types on the right side, who start out with a higher risk, if they work night shifts for a couple of years, their risks goes down to 0. Whereas among the morning types, who start out with a slightly lower risk, if they work night shifts for many years, their risk tends to go up. And that was a significant interaction that made us interested in studying this in greater detail in other contexts, and was pretty much stimulated by this research here, which was sort of looking in a detailed fashion over 3 days. So these are 3-day rhythms of melatonin production among day workers and among 3 nights in a row. So all of these were night shifts, whereas these were all day shifts, stratified by chronotype. You see in blue the morning types, in red the intermediate types, and in green the evening types. On the left hand, people who work 3 days day shifts, you can see that the morning and intermediate types have a more pronounced rhythm here, higher amplitude. In comparison, the evening types are slightly shifted and have a blended amplitude. So now you look at what happens to these rhythms when they work night shifts. And it looks as if these evening types all of a sudden are doing much better, right? Because they're most likely more in line with what their preferred time of activity is. Whereas the morning and intermediate types look much worse. So this type of biology prompted us to look at the interaction in the night worker data and made us ask whether light at night really impacts everyone the same. The concept of chronotype, as I said, the majority of us are somewhere here, maybe leaning more towards the evening or the morning type, but only a few, maybe 10-15% are going to be definite morning types and about 10% definite evening types. And those may be the ones who are, again, impacted most if they experience a mismatch between what one could call their internal clock and the external clock that's imposed by them by working hours. And so, of course, one question coming back to our cancer association is whether chronotype could interact with the association between night work and cancer risk. Basically, do evening types experience a different risk if they work night shifts than morning types? There's hardly any studies that have looked at this. I'm showing you some here. Here's Johnny Hansen's study, for instance, looking at night work and breast cancer risk. Morning types have a 3.9-fold increased risk. What's that in percentage? $290? 290% increased, subtracting the 100% here. So they have a 3.9-fold increased risk, and the morning types or the evening types have a twofold increased risk. So there's a difference between these two risks, right? Depends on the chronotype of a person. A similar study looking at night work and prostate cancer, this was published by Kyriaki and Manolis, and they stratified by chronotype again, looking at morning chronotype. The risk of prostate cancer after many years of night work was 1.79. Among the evening types, it was only 1.33. And here's some of the latest work we've been doing looking at mood disorders for a change, where we also find an interesting interaction between this morning type and night work. Now, this is looking at mood disorders in children of women who worked night shifts. Remember the GUTS cohort, the children of the nurses? These are their children, examining whether the depression among these kids depends on the mom's shift work. And while overall it doesn't, if you stratify by, here you have morning types and here you have evening types, the women who are morning types and worked rotating night shifts, they have a significantly higher risk of having children with mood disorders compared to evening types who work night shifts. So another example of where we think the interaction between night work and chronotype is important and has made us set out to start developing some sort of circadian strain matrices. We're playing around with them at the moment, linking them to BMI as a first endpoint to see whether we can sort of refine our exposure assessment of light at night, taking into account the individual chronotype. And now I'm coming to an end. What does all of this mean? Does it mean we have to kick out the lights, essentially, and no more exposure to light at night? Well, I don't think so, but I do think this means that what we have to do in the future is to much more pay attention to, I want to call it precision prevention. So prevention that sort of takes into account each individual person's risk to the extent possible. And that may be possible if you consider that some of these factors here may determine your risk. Your genetic phenotype, maybe. There's much more work that needs to be done here. Chronotype, maybe specific age ranges. Your baseline melatonin may be predictive. And lifestyle choices that change if people work night shifts. So I think that there's lots of things we need to understand better. There's many other things to study, including meal timing and physical activity and other aspects or site gabers that impact our circadian clock. But overall, this is a very active and moving research area, and anybody who is interested to work on this, I would be happy to talk to, or also Manolis, who has been the leader in this field here in Europe, and is welcome for any exchange of ideas. And this is just to acknowledge the young people who have done much of this work here. Celine Vetter, Lani Wegersin, Eric Su, Claudia Jewel Fitzgerald, and Elizabeth DeVore have been the ones really leading some of the research you have seen. All right, if you have any questions, now would be the time. Yes?
I was thinking about the smaller risk in the evening times, because you were stratified. Could it be that the evening types are already at risk in themselves because they are staying up longer, so they are already exposed to the same risk factors?
In fact, that's what you do see here. That's definitely the case. So I want to go back to this one slide on diabetes risk, where you can see it very clearly. Here, right? I think that's what you're pointing to. The evening types do have a higher risk to begin with.
Yeah.
But if you align their work hours with, I guess, what their internal clock is, by having them work night shifts, their risk goes down. So these are evening types who have no shift work exposure, who work day shifts essentially. They have a higher risk, yeah. But maybe this is because they have to work hours against their clock, right? Because they stay up until 3 o'clock in the morning and then they still have to get up at 6 or 7 to go to work, right? So that's the idea here.
So they live less life because they're staying up when it's dark outside and they sleep in the morning.
Also, yeah, definitely a good point, yeah. Yes?
really interesting talk. I just wanted to make a quick comment on UK Biobank, because
Yes.
there's quite a debate about it in the UK right now.
Yeah, please.
Because it's a fantastic study, but the response rate was only 5.5%. And normally, like if you get two factors that both affect selection into the study, they're going to be associated with each other, even if they're not associated in the population. And for most cohorts, it's trivial, but when you've only got a 5% response rate, you start to get funny findings. And the mortality for the first 5 years is only 25% that of the UK population, so clearly there's a health selection. But I've never seen the data for this, but I'm told that also there's more morning people agree to take part than evening people.
Interesting.
And presumably they found it easier to get up in time to go to the clinic. So if that's true, you're going to find associations between, chronotype and various outcomes, at least in the first 5 years of follow-up, because of these, both of them have selection effects.
As I have to think, I think Selena, there is just a new study that came out looking at diabetes risk, in the night workers in the UK Biobank and some genetics. They also looked at interactions by chronotype and didn't find any, but given what you say, that may not be a surprise. Right? Yeah, no, there's lots of issues that really have to be carefully considered when you look at any data coming out of this biobank.
It's actually similar to the healthy worker effect, and it's likely to be stronger for some outcomes and exposures than others, and it's likely to wear off over time.
Right.
So a group of us are thinking of trying to get the methods for looking at the healthy worker effect and try and apply them to UK Biobank to come out with some conclusions as to what it is reliable for and what it's not reliable for.
What's the average follow-up now in the biobank?
Must be about 10 years now, I think.
10 years?
So there's been follow-up published for 5 years. I think it's 8 to 10 years of actual follow-up now.
So you get to a point where you could look at this, stratified by follow-up. Yeah, that would be very useful for everybody. Yes?
Yeah. Do you think that the companies for the night shift workers changes the policies of light or illumination inside the areas depending if they are doing day or night? Because I don't think that the light intensity changes inside the rooms.
Yeah.
Maybe during the night shift the light should be higher to reset more easily the clock, because during the day they are sleeping, so there is more difference between day, but for them it's night, but
Yeah.
for to have more light exposure,
Right.
that it was like day.
I think if I summarize this, you're asking whether there's a way to modulate light for night workers so that it can sort of not lead to an increased risk or help reset their clocks. This is a complicated question. For one, we have multiple different endpoints. If you talk to people who are looking at accident risk in hospitals or whatever, immediate outcomes, you need a lot of light to prevent those. You need people who are alert, who are not getting tired. If you start lowering light levels at night, for instance, you run the risk of, while you may be slowly decreasing the risk for chronic diseases, you may increase the risk for accidents. The same thing goes for driving home after work. Lots of people after night work get tired, If you give them a light stimulus in the morning, it can reset the clock to the new time, and maybe prevent accidents when they drive home. But on the other hand, people rotate and they may not be on the same schedule, then they need to be going back to night work the next day. So for every single aspect, you can come up with a pro and con why something would be good versus not. I know that the lighting industry is really onto this, because for them, I think I give them that they try to do something good, but they also want to make some money out of it, I think. So they have been coming forward with lots of suggestions. I think, each of them has to be looked at from a scientific standpoint to the degree possible, whether or not this could be beneficial. And if you think about what I said on my last slide with the precision prevention, right? None of this is gonna fit everyone the same. Some people may need a little more light, a little less. So it's like a broad type of prevention again that doesn't take into consideration each individual. But yeah, with light, you can do all sorts of things. It's powerful. But it's hard to find solutions for people who are chronically exposed, maybe rotating shift work, which is, from our assessment, the worst type of shift, because it never lets you align with a new rhythm. You keep shifting back and forth. So it's hard.
So is there any evidence on that? Because it was my question. Any evidence
Okay.
on rotating shift works if
Versus permanent.
than maintaining shift work for a longer period that you
Yeah.
showed in your results? So
Right. No, I mean, for the longest time we have been pushing that a lot. Now we are sort of going into different areas slightly, but yes, the common notion is that rotating is worse than permanent, because I always try to think of it as if you keep flying from Europe to the United States, 2 days later you fly back and you fly there. Your body takes about 5 to 7 days to adjust to a new, when you're jet lagged, to a new time zone. The same is with night work. You would slowly adjust to it, and we see this in our detailed studies that after 4 or 5 days, eventually the circadian rhythm starts to catch up and has shifted. But, with rotating night workers, you have this phenomenon where they keep shifting every couple of days and never quite enough time to adjust to something. This is also true for permanent night workers, because they still have weekends off or holidays, right, where they probably go back to a regular rhythm. But at least they have longer stretches where somehow their body can adjust in between to night work. Or maybe there are people who work 20 night shifts a month. Maybe they keep staying on that night shift routine even when they're off shift. So yes, rotating is worse than permanent, most likely. Yeah?
Thank you so much. I was quite surprised from this evidence linking breast cancer with night shift work, because I'm not really into this topic, but I was acknowledged of a Cochrane review of a few years ago, and the conclusion of this Cochrane review was not prone for an evidence of an association, but for a lack of evidence of association between breast cancer and night shift work. So
This,
you have an idea of what
yeah, it must. Yeah, no, I'm dead certain this was not a Cochrane review, because I'm currently talking to the Cochrane review. Because I was thinking, with all this meta-analysis, it might be good to have one thorough one, and they don't do reviews of observational studies. I think they might be considering it. I'm not sure what's the outcome gonna be for the first time or something, because they have been discussing that some of these, especially occupational exposures, may warrant some Cochrane reviews, but there would not exist one yet. What you have likely seen is a meta-analysis.
Yes, it
And
was a systematic review and meta-analysis of, I think, 4
yes.
or 5 years
Yeah.
ago.
And yes, I know. There are now lots of them, and each of them gives you a different answer. You can pick, basically. I still think that the ones that support an increased risk are more. I think probably 2/3 of them, but there are some, yes, who show somehow they summarize, for instance, never ever night work, where you never see an increased risk for never ever night work. It's way too crude. So if you use that measure and you do a meta-analysis, you won't see something either. They are usually need to be looked at carefully. If they
What I mean for an occupational physician is to have a paper from Cochrane Group or Cochrane Collaboration saying that it is not associated. So occupational physician say,
Yeah.
okay, I have not to
Well,
to this risk for the
yes, but except for this was not a Cochrane review. I would agree with you, but this was not, definitely not. There doesn't exist one yet today, a Cochrane review. It may have been a regular meta-analysis, which are being published a lot, And each of them has their own shortcomings. Some of them may be really good. But yeah, what I would look at the moment is probably IARC, the monographs, or there's a new monograph that's worked on, or sort of monograph that may come up in a year or so. Don't know how long that takes. So when you really have experts coming together and spending a lot of time discussing the strengths and weaknesses of each study and putting weight on them, these types of reviews are helpful, not the ones that you find plentiful now, unfortunately, that are usually done by people who are not in the field and have a hard time assessing the importance of each single study. All right. Oral intake of melatonin as a preventive. I think it's used as a sleep aid for jet lag too, for chronic intake over many years to prevent cancer to develop. There's no studies showing that they don't have any side effects over many years. For a few months, we know it doesn't have a side effect, but you would need to take it a long time, and since we don't know what that means, I would not recommend it at the moment. Yeah?
Practical with my mom's nurse, and I know that some of colleagues of her, they can sleep after the night shift, and some can't. So it's like, is there, I don't know, some differences and research about that difference in persons who sleep after this and who are not, like, you know?
It's an interesting question. I don't have a good answer to that, but it could be.
You know that there is difference in really this, like colleagues and people who can sleep and who can't. You're just
I'm sure, yeah. No, I think it could be interesting to sort of look at the differences in whatever predictors there could be for why they sleep well. Maybe it's genetics or maybe something else. But yeah, this would be interesting to study. And yes, and then after that I think we need to close, right?
Last question.
So I imagine that who is like exposed to light overnight and works night shifts, it's like might develop also like worse food habits or like might training out.
Definitely.
So how much actually are these other factors influencing like chronic disease, developing the chronic disease?
Yeah.
And compared to like melatonin?
Oh, yes, I mean, Manolis may speak more to it. These weren't individual studies at the moment among non-night workers, right? And they all seem to play a role. Then, at some point, one has to take them into account in night workers. Probably they all add up, but at the moment we're glad if we can look at non-night workers and find, as we do, some interesting associations, and then need to put it into context. Okay. It's warm here, huh?
Let's come back in 30 minutes and we'll start the exercise.